Hi everyone, I'm Chelsea Pettitt, Head of Arts at the Bagri Foundation. Welcome to The Bottom Drawer, Books That Changed My Life. This is a series that forms part of our theme of change for 2021, and it's actually the second season of The Bottom Drawer. This season, we wanted to feature writers who have their UK debuts, and they've just been published. We asked them about books from their early years, what they started to write, what inspired them to write, and also books that changed their life. So for the first in our series, I'm welcoming Te-Ping Chen, author of the book Land of Big Numbers. Now, Te-Ping Chen is based in Philadelphia, and her fiction has been published in The New Yorker, Granta, Guernica, Tin House, The Atlantic. You can read her full biography on our website and below this video. So thank you so much, Te-Ping, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I kind of wanted to start at the beginning. I really loved the book. It's a book of short stories. But I thought, let's talk about some of your earlier work because you're a journalist. You've probably been writing for many years. What did the early works look like?
Yeah, so they were all over the map. I wrote poetry. I wrote, a few different sort of abortive novels, one full one. The one that I was working on just before starting Land of Big Numbers was like this big, sprawling, sort of multi-generational family novel that had sort of scenes in 1930s Shanghai and also California, like present day California. And yeah, I experimented with a lot of different kinds of settings and characters before arriving at Land of Big Numbers.
Did you always gravitate towards fiction? Because
I
as
did,
a
yeah.
journalist, yes,
As
as a journalist, you're not
absolutely.
writing about fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was someone who, from when I was young, just loved to read books and loved fiction, and that was what felt like home to me. I essentially, like, I feel like I grew up in libraries. Like my mom would drop us off, and my sister and I would just read. And yeah, and so even though my day job, obviously, I work as a journalist. For me, in terms of my own writing, it's always been sort of fiction.
Oh, great. And so was there a sort of moment or a book that you remember thinking, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to be someone who writes, not just reads.
Yeah. It's hard to point to just one. I mean, when I was young, there were definitely books that made just a deep impression on me, and that I really felt just astonishment for. I loved C.S. Lewis. I loved the Land of Oz series,
Mhm.
which was one where it was just like this world that was so surreal and strange, but also very human and believable and fantastical all at once. And truly, it left such a mark on me that I remember until I was 10 years old, I was really genuinely convinced that I was also going to be whisked off at some point to Oz. And I just, it so fully rooted itself in me that I think it really opened my eyes to a sense of what fiction could be. Um, and that was really powerful when I was young.
That's so interesting because I also loved the Oz
Mm.
series when I was young, and but I was also a little bit obsessed with like Alice in Wonderland for the same reason. You know,
Absolutely.
it's that transporting of an alternative world that is so creative that it just gives you such freedom to imagine.
Yeah,
Um, and then when
exactly.
they made the movies, it was almost exactly how I had imagined the characters from the
Oh,
movies as well.
from the Oz movies? I haven't seen them. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, oh, very, very good. Well, I wonder then, in terms of which writers now maybe
Yeah,
are influencing your work, who
yeah.
are they? Who should we read?
So when I was writing Land of Big Numbers, some of my favorite short story writers who definitely, I think, influenced the collection I was reading, um, George Saunders, Carmen Maria Machado are some that I really love. I was also reading Leslie Arima's wonderful collection, and then also repeatedly returning to writers like Maylee Malloy, who's a short story writer who I just adore, and her stories are just so crystalline and set in very different places than Land of Big Numbers, which is of course set in China. She writes sort of these austere stories set often in sort of the American West. But yeah, I love her work. And when I was writing Land of Big Numbers in particular, also I was this was my first time sort of trying to write short stories, and so I spent a lot of time with June Lahiri's Interprimalities, just trying to sort of break down and understand like how short stories worked.
Well, that leads very nicely to my next question, because it is about the, the short story has to pack so much in it. So how do you sort of then, how do you work on character and story development in fewer words?
Yeah. And in some ways, it's, I think, a bit similar to journalism in that you're looking for, right, like those moments that are the most telling and those particular details, right, that just kind of bring a whole character to life. Like I'm thinking of Lulu in that in the opening story, right?
Mhm.
This young woman who's so promising as a student and ends up becoming, sort of this online dissident. And she's somebody who loves to read. She's in as a child, she sits and scans the back of like a juice box. She's compulsively like unable to see words and not try and parse them, to not try and essentially just to, she's someone who walks the world trying to understand it, right? She has this incredible sort of ache inside of her and energy too, right? To try and make sense of the world. And so like things like that, I think details that really help, they're small, but they open up so much about a person.
Yeah. Oh, that explains it then, because you're right. There is so much detail around somebody's kind of daily. I don't know. So
Mm.
it's like their daily life, and so
Yeah.
you get this little intro into a sort of a glimpse in the window. And what I love about the short story, um, well, short stories generally, I suppose, is that ability to be a fly on the wall kind of a thing.
Mm.
And I love movies like that too. Some people hate movies that have like no end, like a proper ending that
Right.
somehow wraps a bow on everything. But I love that kind of open-endedness, and a lot of your stories have that open-endedness too, which
Yeah, I think it's almost like you're getting to kind of like take a train ride with a stranger, right? And hear about their life and you see them like at the very particular moment in their life. And um yeah, there's something really wonderful about the genre, just that it captures like that fleetingness too of a particular moment. And you get to see sort of the weight and meaning in a particular moment like that.
yeah. And so did you actually write all these stories and then submit them to various publishers to get your debut out there, or was it some of your previous work had been noticed? How did you go about things?
So I wrote the collection and then I submitted it to agents. And then it was only actually after, no, the first story was published in the New Yorker. That was before the book sold. And then once the book found a publisher, at that point, the publisher decided, because they wanted to give it sort of a longer runway in terms of pub time. And so the idea was to sort of start giving readers a bit of a taste in certain publications at least.
Great. Well, I'm really excited that it's come out here this year. And I read it quite quickly, so I read it again because it's. I think the short story format allows me to dip in quite quickly. I'm a fast reader anyway, but there was so much detail and symbolism in so many of the stories that I felt like I needed another kind of slower go over them. And I rarely read books more than once, so I was it really did hit me. Like, yeah, I think afterwards I told my colleague, I just thought, I can't believe how much it's resonated. But it's been kind of a while since that's happened. And so I wanted to talk a little about some of the themes that seemed um, similar across some of the stories,
Yeah.
especially around obsession. Obsession seems to be running throughout. The kind of questioning of relationships, whether they're sort of abusive or falling apart or maybe unequal. And I wondered where that is coming from, if that's something you even noticed that you were doing, if it's something that you only maybe had noticed afterwards, what was connecting them. Yeah, where that kind of came from.
I love that you observed those themes. I don't. They weren't intentional, not those anyway. And that's been so interesting. Like since the book has been out, just seeing what different people read into the book and take away. Though I do think you're onto something with obsessives. I know I've always, just as a writer and certainly when I was in China as a reporter, always loved obsessives. I mean, I think people who have sort of this supercharged love and fascination for something, right? That can be so contagious. And so, like in, for example, Cao Cao, the story Flying Machine, this
Mhm.
elderly farmer who sets out to build a plane, like he's just an example of someone like that, right? Who sets his mind to something so fiercely and creates this whole universe for himself. And there were so many stories and characters like that that I ran across and wrote about as a reporter. I,
Mhm.
everything from, I'm thinking of I wrote stories about these rock collectors in China who are obsessed with rocks that look like a certain kind of meat, like some that look like bacon, some that look like stewed pork. And it was just this whole like
Yeah.
subculture that was fascinating. You know, or like robots that make noodles, which is another motif that appears in the book. I mean, all these like very particular loves. And yeah, I think just the way that they say, I mean, of course, in a China context, I think like it's really interesting to see how like things like robot chopping noodles who chop noodles and all that, like they also say something I think about where the country's economy is, and also just sort of the wild inventiveness that you do run into in the country. So I think that that's probably where a lot of that feeling and emotion comes from.
Oh, lovely. I did wonder, yeah, if it had sort of been related to some of the things you were writing about as a journalist, because there can be so many wonderful human stories, that come out in
Yeah,
papers
yeah,
and journal.
absolutely.
That's great. You've said before about this book that they're stories that address the past and illuminate the present, I think was the way you put it.
Mhm.
And that's definitely true. And there's some more of that I'll talk about in a minute. But I also sort of initially found a subtle, almost not sci-fi, but almost multiverse or alternative kind of universe going on in some of them. Some of them felt a little bit unidentifiable,
Mhm.
but very near future. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how it kind of represents or reflects on where we're going or what kind of future.
Yeah. I mean, I think in trying to conjure up this world, this country for readers, part of it is offering that sense like of what it is in modern China today, which is it's a country where you do feel so this keen awareness of sort of the dimensionality of time. I mean, it is a place where you'll spend time in a village that feels like it hasn't changed for a half century, and then you go to sort of a second or third tier city, some of which appear in this book, and you have this feeling of this uneasy sort of an industrial transition, like sort of stuck in the 80s and big hair still and like certain kinds of architecture. And then there's cities like Shanghai, which also is a character of sorts in the book, and where you very much feel like you're just on the precipice of things and on the edge of the future. Likewise in Beijing, in one of the stories in this collection is set in sort of near future Beijing, where yeah, I think just the idea of giving readers this sense of how there is such that multiplicity that is a big part of the experience in China, and just how yeah, at points, I mean, as you say, it almost does feel a bit like sci-fi, but again, it's a country where the government modifies the weather, decides when it's going to rain. I mean, some of the um yeah, some of the details that appear in the book feel like science fiction, but I think to folk who've spent time in the country or followed it, I mean, some I think will be quite familiar. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. I think I started reading it and thought, oh, it's so futuristic. She's wearing a lanyard. I think it is
Right.
Lucy that wears a lanyard that tells people she works in the city. And then I kind of realized, oh no, that's all happening now. Like actually, we're living in this sci-fi future now. It's
Yeah.
almost we're here. We've arrived. That's how
Yeah.
it felt.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's I'm thinking too of that, the lantern and the tracking, and just how now we're living in an era of COVID passports, and in China, having to scan in order to get access to certain places. Yeah, all these ingredients that
Mm.
were not intended to be quite so evocative of our present reality, but inadvertently were more so than I anticipated.
Yeah, well, that sort of relates to one of my favorite stories, which actually is the one that compelled me to email you and invite you to join, which was Gubeko Spirit. And it resonated with me because just the day before I was speaking to my colleague about my somewhat irrational fear of getting stuck on the tube. Like the thing I don't like about London is having to get on the underground and not knowing if I'll get out. And I think this story, of course, Pan gets stuck on the underground, but it goes so much further than that. An entire city is developed. And in some ways, I don't want to give away what happens,
Yeah.
but the ease at which they all just lived there and
Yeah.
was like, oh, we can't get out. So there we are. Kind of reminded me of the ease in which we all find ourselves stuck at home and not leaving and just following the rules. And,
Yeah.
it felt very claustrophobic reading it. And then it really hit home that we're all kind of stuck or we have been. And I was wondering if, yeah, obviously when you were writing and it would have been before all of this, and then how you reflect on that now in terms
Yeah.
of living.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I love that you're likewise someone who, when you're on a train, like looks around and thinks, "Oh my God, what happened? What would happen if we got stuck?" And because that is a thought that has flashed in my mind so many times, and partly from just sort of an anthropological point of view, I've always one I think had sort of maybe an apocalyptic turn of mind, but also just been so curious to think, sometimes when I find myself in situations like what would happen if we subverted it slightly, right? Um and so in the story, Gubeko Spirit, you see this play out as sort of this experiment, like what would happen if people got stuck? And yeah, I mean, for me, it was really, a little bit in keeping with how all of the last year has almost felt like, let's say, a mass experiment on that.
Yeah.
Um, I think, for me, the writing of that story was really about exploring the fluidity of human nature in some ways, and how so much is contextual, and so much of what we decide to adapt to and embrace and ultimately accept
Mhm.
is so malleable, right? And
Yeah.
that's so fascinating. I mean, I think that's true in any context, as we've seen this year, but I think it's an especially interesting question to explore in China, which obviously is, a place that where the government dictates, very specifically how citizens' lives can be arranged and what kind of possibilities are open to people. And that, so yeah, I mean, I think exploring that arc of how people navigate, this strange new reality, the
Mhm.
ways that they feel ultimately in some ways empowered by it, but also, with other characters,
Mhm.
start to chafe. And yeah, this big open question of, well, what would happen? How will this end?
Yeah, and I think you're right. The thing that connects so many of the stories too, is that uh, is that government control. I mean, it's in the new fruit story. It's in the flying machine. And it's almost it's in Lulu's story. Lulu's story. It comes across in all of them, and I think that is. I'm assuming that living and working in China and understanding the kind of control systems that are in place. But then, of course, with COVID, almost all the countries in the world have started using similar kind of control systems. So it's been, yeah, really, really fascinating now to read that, because I lived in China in 2005 for a while,
Mm,
and yeah, similarly, even the school that I taught English at had gates and guards, and you couldn't
mm,
really, the
mm.
students weren't allowed to leave. And so I was sort of immediately thrust into that
Yeah.
of control, and yeah, the weather control, all kinds of things. And but now reading it, living in the West, and thinking, yeah, it's happening here too. It's such a
Yeah. And then, I mean, to say nothing of sort of surveillance technologies that have,
mm,
obviously like rippled out. Yeah.
yeah, fascinating. But it does lead me to one of my other really a story that I got really, to use the word obsessed, I kind of delved into, maybe in too much detail, I'll find out now, but the new fruit story. um, so the new fruit story, the fruit, you give it the name Chiguo,
Mhm.
and from my understanding of how that's translated is chi, like energy or life force, and guo being country. So there's some kind of this fruit embodying the spirit of a country, right? And so I'm thinking, okay, the fruit makes everyone happy, and then it makes everyone really, really, really sad and possibly suicidal. And the government steps in to try and control this to make the fruit happy. And in some ways, it made me think of, the idea of bread and circuses, keeping
Mhm.
people happy so they won't revolt.
Yeah.
But also, you mentioned a song that's written about it, and you use the
Mhm.
word strange fruit, which then made me think of Billie Holiday and
Mhm.
the lynching of Black Americans and what that
Yeah.
song represented. And all of a sudden, I saw it as some kind of comment on American
Mm.
country, American spirit of the American country being this
Yeah.
terrible history of treatment
Yeah.
of Americans. And I guess I just wondered, it, is that the intention? Is that what you want people to read these stories and think about all of these kind of multi layers, or is that
Yeah. I mean, I hope that's the case. And again, just to see how the stories have evoked so many different responses and people finding connections in them that I hadn't honestly intended, just and what you outlined. Um, Yeah, I mean, I think so. Chico for me, I was thinking I hadn't even thought of like the chi in the way that you had thought of it. I was thinking of it chi just like chico, I like strange, peculiar, this peculiar fruit. So my translation is maybe even a little bit more literal and mundane. But I love thinking about this fruit that transfigures people's lives. And we spoke earlier about sort of a desire and tendency to want to invert scenes and situations, and just this curiosity of what might happen if you put people in a certain situation, in the same way that, again, just I think all of life is sort of a grand human
Yeah.
experiment, and obviously certain countries particularly so. And I think this particular story for me, I mean, I hadn't been thinking really about that American parallel, but you're right. I mean, I think it's there because I think the story is ultimately so much about you know what it means to live a life in which you ultimately end up quite deliberately looking away from things that you feel might harm you, or that might harm your sense of self, that make you feel guilty, that threaten to undercut the way that society coheres. In the case of new fruit, of course, some of these things are very personal, right? Um, they might be things that people have done in their past life, but some of them are broader and more social too. And people start remembering things having to do with the Cultural Revolution, and others as well. And that to me was just what I think there's a lot of affection in that story, and that portrait of that neighborhood of just a very particular part of Beijing that I love a lot. But I think it's also there's a lot of wistfulness too. This sort of, and when I've heard from Chinese readers about that story, I mean that's part of what the feedback I've gotten is just like the sense of like wistfulness and catharsis, and getting to see even though it's fiction, getting to see these characters have that feeling of suddenly this veil being lifted right through this fruit, and being able to explore and unearth all of these memories in ways that are painful but ultimately also prove
Mm.
powerful in some ways, and affirming in others. And yeah, just something that you might not see happen in real life in China, but getting to explore that in fiction, I think as a reader, and just no matter where you are, I think that that sense of that there's certain things that we very deliberately don't want to explore, but also just how ultimately powerful it can be when we do, is something that is more universal.
Yeah, and I really loved that you used fruit as a symbol for that.
Mhm.
I don't know, there's something about the fruit being, I think in every country, everyone has some kind of, fruit that kind of, um, I don't know, people love and get excited about. I mean, right now it's mango season across South
Oh,
Asia. So,
yeah.
all of everyone I know is just like posting that them eating these delicious mangoes. So
Oh,
everyone has this kind of fascination and love for a particular kind of fruit. And um,
yeah, and there's a little bit of lust attached to it. There's a question of like what is excessive. There, yeah, all these really charged emotions. And I've been struck too. There have been so many readers that have emailed me also parallels to other stories. Like there was apparently some bread, I can't remember, on some island that apparently made people hallucinate and sort of also have these different visions. So yeah, more real life parallels maybe than I again intended.
Yeah. I mean, do you get emails just randomly from people going, I love this story, this is what it did for
Yeah.
me." Oh, that's so
Yeah, which is yeah, it's been so surprising, but lovely. Yeah, a lot of folk reaching out.
what has been the kind of biggest response? Is there, I don't know whether it's out of Chinese readers who are really gravitating towards a particular story, or maybe even for you that there was one particular, one or two really particular stories that kind of you feel really passionately about.
And the story that I feel probably most passionately about is Flying Machine, that story about this rural inventor who builds that plane, just because it speaks to the side of China that I think is can be hard to access through headlines. And it is so much of what I loved about living there is this feeling of possibility and this incredible ingenuity,
Mhm.
and sense of ambition that is just so powerful to see. And like Taltal, he's a really charismatic character, I find anyway.
Yeah.
And he's someone I had a lot of love for in writing. And that story also wraps all these sorts of surprising details of life in China that I stumbled upon as a reporter. Everything from funeral strippers. There's that scene right when the party secretary wants to generate more turnout for this funeral, and so he hires a stripper, which yeah, it's based on something that yeah, a real phenomenon in China. And I just thought was it's just there's so many juxtapositions in that story, right? And there are parts that feel fabulous, right? But in fact, anything in that story, it's not like New Fruit or one of the other stories that has more magic words. Everything in there is
Yeah.
is intended to be written in a much more realist fashion, and yet it does have that sense, I think, of um yeah, just things feeling on a scale and felt with an intensity and with ambition set in such a way that they're just larger than life. And
Yeah.
that is, yeah, true to the country, and a part of the country that I love.
That's great. I mean, I really loved The Flying Machine as well. And I was thinking, I did have a question actually related to the hope that came from that
Mm,
story, because there's also I guess, the importance of it being an elderly gentleman who's based in a rural area who has a place but wants to do something bigger than that, right? And so
yeah.
there's a really lovely, as an inventor, he thinks I can change the world, even though I'm being told that this is what I need to be doing out here and
Right.
growing food in rural areas. And I loved that, yeah, that element of ambition and hope. And funnily enough, in the short story Land of Big Numbers as well, there's that character who, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name now, who,
Yufeng, the main character? Yeah.
yeah, who's getting himself into debt very,
Mhm.
very badly, right? And but it's coming from a place of ambition. Oh, but I
Yeah.
can do it. And it's getting better, and this is getting better, and I can make this money. And then it just goes, downhill. But even then, it still ends on a hopeful note where he says, "I'll
Mhm.
be fine. Just give it
Mhm.
another few days."
Yeah.
And that comes across in in some ways, in most of the stories, the
Yeah.
open-endedness, the hopefulness. Um,
Yeah. And I think it is interesting too, the degree to which like short stories in general I find often, and I think the ones in this collection in particular do act as almost sort of a Rorschach test of sorts. Because I love that you read it that way, but others I think might read that and think, oh no, like at the ending, Jufeng is clearly headed in a certain way, and it's all, yeah. I think it's so much of these stories, right? Like perhaps maybe in some ways more than a level, like you're bringing, you're projecting more of yourself, I think, onto this canvas that's been built. And I'm so tickled to hear that that's how you felt, because that absolutely is how I felt in the writing of it, right? Because yeah, and that's why I wanted the collection to end with Gubeka Spirit, because likewise it felt like that sort of story that does end on that note of hope.
yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think I just want to ask now, what's next? Are you able to tour the book at some point later in the year, or?
um no such plans. I mean, I might do like a few in-person events here and there, but it still feels hard to see, for now online.
Oh. Well, lastly, I suppose is, what would you recommend everybody who's listening or watching read next? What should be on our reading list?
Oh, wow, that is a tough one. Well, since we are talking about, let's see, ah, ah, well, I will recommend, since we're talking about a China book, another one of my favorites, Do Not Say Nothing. It's a really beautiful book that's based on sort of events of the Cultural Revolution set in this classical music context and its effect on musicians during that era. It's really beautifully written. Yeah,
That sounds
highly recommended.
great. Thank you so much. That sounds really, really great. Well, thank you, Te-Ping, so much for joining. And I can't thank you enough for writing this book. I can't wait to see what else you're going to be, yeah, publishing in future.
Thank you for.
And yeah, please keep in touch online, and send us requests and things that you think we should be reading, and all of that. I think everybody would be really pleased to hear your thoughts. So
Thank you.
thanks for everyone for listening. Do check out the next Bottom Drawer interview, which will be with Nima Shah, interviewed by Ashanti Omkar, and that will be released on June 3rd. So yeah, thanks so much, everyone.